So we're going to be looking at Behat in Drupal. That's a testing framework that I use a lot in Drupal, and talking about what it is, what it's about, why you should use it, why it's awesome, and how it's not really scary. Before I jump into Behat and just go into maybe technical examples, I think it's important to kind of step out and think about testing in general. And this is not Drupal specific. This is to reiterate something Josh was talking about this morning. Drupal is working on getting off the island. Treating Drupal like it's real software, and that means testing and focusing on quality. So why should you even bother with testing in the first place? Well, as a development team or professional services shop, things that matter to you are, you want better code quality, that way you can deliver better quality products. You want less regressions. You don't want to be spending as much time doing QA and introducing as few bugs as possible, and catching ones that you wouldn't have caught otherwise is important. Better acceptance criteria is a big one. What the heck are we actually building? How do we know that it's done? How do we agree that it's actually done, and defining what those states are? Another important one is a greater understanding of your code base. If you have to test and assert and validate that things are performing the way they are, it forces you to gradually grow and get a better understanding of your code base and stop relying on the abstractions. The abstractions are great in Drupal, and this is a great thing of Drupal, is you can jump in and rely on a lot of the subsystems to do the heavy lifting for you. But when it comes time to guaranteeing that the subsystems are doing the exact behavior that the client wanted, it's important to make sure that we're understanding what's happening there. Another thing is faster development. And that's bold because it sounds counterintuitive. I'm saying testing matters, you should be writing tests, which takes time. Learning to write tests takes time. Spending the time to architect and have the conversations with the client and actually writing your tests and fixing failing tests takes time. But it leads to faster development. As you grow, as the project extends and you get that greater understanding of your code base through the lifespan of the project, you're going to be able to implement new features better and maintain your existing features better. A kind of obvious one is you're going to have fewer bugs. You're going to catch bugs sooner, which means you don't have to spend as much time in a QA sprint later down the road. You're not going to spend as much time going back and dealing with bugs that were introduced a while ago. And kind of a non-intuitive one when I'm talking about not introducing bugs is we're going to assert and we're going to be testing for bugs on a regular basis, which means we'll find them sooner, as opposed to putting in 3 sprints or a few months worth of work and introducing a bug at the very beginning that no one catches, and then building the rest of your code base on top of that bug for the next 3 months. That can be crippling. So, and I've seen scenarios before where they have a QA sprint at the end, find out the system that we built all of our systems on top of is flawed and doesn't actually meet behaviors. So it can lead to faster development. It's important to actually think about quality. It's a fun thought from a developer perspective is, how many W2Fs are you throwing out reviewing a code base? It's important for you and your team to think about quality and discuss it on a team and project by project basis. It's important what it means to you as a team, including the client. Are you building an API? Is it going to be important to have very meticulously documented code? Is it important that your code is factored and refactored to be as highly optimized as possible? Understand and agree as a team what is important and what quality means to you, so you can know where to focus your time on. I think as developers, given our own unsupervised way, we'd be fine with refactoring our code until it was absolutely perfect and perfectly optimized and writing all of the tests ever, but there's not always the best client value in that. So have the conversations early up front, agree what it is, and make plans around that. And just to reiterate that, yes, I said faster development. I've seen this firsthand. I've been on projects, and there's some research around it to support this, that writing tests up front, automating and ensuring them on any level ultimately will lead to faster development. There's a bit of an asterisk of you are putting upfront time to get your test written, and you're putting that workload up front. But ultimately, you're going to increase your team's velocity. Your team's going to be more confident in the code that they're delivering and the features that they're delivering. Your client's it's going to increase trust between you and the client, and you're going to have to deal with less QA issues down the road. So it's not just about us. It's also about clients and giving values to our clients. Why should your clients care about testing? well, they're going to get a better product. They're going to have better product quality. They're going to have less bugs, and they're going to have less bugs that are introduced in the product to their end users or whoever the users of the product are. Better acceptance criteria for them means you're actually building what they need to accomplish their business goals, which are important. You're not just building what they say they want, you're building what they actually need, which is important to make the distinction. And they're also going to see faster development, which, and for them at the end of the project, means they're going to get more bang for their buck. Now, interestingly enough, the client, the why the client should care and why we should care kind of overlaps. Like we ultimately want the same goal as developers and clients. Like as developers, we want to build the best product we can, and as clients, you want something that accomplishes your business goals, and you want whatever that best solution is. So up front, like our goals are the same. It's about convincing both teams or convincing our clients that we have your goals and interests, and building tools that help accomplish that. So that's great and wonderful. If what I said is true, why isn't everyone testing? Why aren't we doing it now? There's a whole slew of reasons, or pseudo reasons, or what I would call more excuses. Kind of up front, testing takes time. If you let your client kind of go through a menu and itemize your project budget, one of the first things that'll probably get cut would be testing. Well, we don't need testing, we need more features. The assumption the client makes is, you're a lot of times you're an outside provider or vendor, and it's about building up trust, and they don't really feel that you have their best interest at heart right away. So their way of mitigating this risk is kind of throwing as many features as they can and get as much work as they can out of you. Opposed to this, we take the testing approach of defining our acceptance criteria and actually asserting our acceptance criteria is met to ensure that we're actually meeting your business goals, and we're going to increase our velocity with stuff that actually matters to the client's business needs. There are actually some interesting case studies done, and I combined the numbers from both projects here for averages, but Microsoft and IBM kind of did some analysis of several of their teams, because they're large organizations with tons and tons of teams and projects running concurrently. And they found that their teams that were using test-driven development as opposed to non-test-driven development, the kind of tried and true, just we'll build it and run QA manually or after the fact methodologies, they found they were finding 40 to 90% fewer bugs. And what this resulted at the end of the project was, because they had fewer bugs and less regression, they actually had about 15 to 35% additional development time to focus in on the features rather than dealing with regression bugs. Another excuse, writing tests are hard. I think one of the first things I bring up when I talk to anyone in Drupal 7 about testing in Drupal, someone will inevitably ask me about simple tests. They're painful, they're difficult, they take forever, it's hard to get into. Additionally, some of the other testing tools that are out there, like PHP Unit and PHP Spec, are great. We struggle to leverage them effectively in Drupal 7. But here's the thing, imperfect tests run frequently are just as are more valuable than no tests at all. Asserting anything that we can, any behavior or any unit, whatever kind of testing you're doing, is working as expected, is better than the alternative. And you'll find, with experience, as you end up rolling, your testing strategies get better. As you get that experience and knowledge, you'll find where there's more value writing tests and where you can kind of get away with spoofing it, or where there's not much value in it. Any level of testing is important and valuable. So, enough of the reasons why and how awesome it is. I'm going to talk about Behat. Behat's the kind of magic tool in Drupal we're talking about today to step in and solve all of our problems. Behat is what they call a behavior-driven development framework. BDD is kind of a combination of test-driven development where you write your test up front and you then write your software and your functionality to satisfy your test. Behavior-driven development is an extension of that, whereas you define client requests or requirements as behaviors very explicitly. You agree on that using a common language, and you can assert what that feature is, what it means to have it done, and what done actually means for you. And you have a test framework to support that. It's written all in PHP, and it's comprised of several tools. These are all standalone frameworks, but we're going to talk about using these in Drupal. Because we're using something in Drupal, there's a module for that. Of course there is. Kind of. There's a Drupal module for that in the same sense that Drush is considered a Drupal module. They have a spot on a Drupal project page. They're not actually a module that you would install, but there is an extension. The beauty of this is, Behat was meant to run on a PHP framework or software. Drupal extension does an excellent job of wiring Behat up to Drupal for you. It is going to make a lot of assumptions for you about your possibly like implementation or how certain tests would run. So there are pros and cons there. It's a great way to get off the ground. It's a great way to wire it up to Drupal. But if you have a very complex site with complex requirements that requires complex testing, relying on their assumptions may not be the best thing for you. But for now, we're going to stick with Drupal extension. Installation, I'm not going to really cover a whole lot because this may be outdated in a month or two as updates roll out. Basically, you can install the dependencies with Composer, which is kind of where Drupal's shifting anyway. We're trying our very best to get off our island and treat our software like it has real dependencies. So you just would define Behat and then the Behat extension. Because that's dependency management, they'll pull in several libraries along with that, like Gherkin and some kind of WebDriver. And there's a YAML configuration file that you can set up to run these. If you're looking to install, you can just use your Google Powers. It's probably more up to date than my slides will be in a month. So let's see what writing tests about and what Behat actually looks like. Starting from kind of the top of the food chain of, we got a requirement from a client and we're walking through the process of how we would build this in Drupal. Client comes to us and says, I want to be able to log into my site. And actually, to be honest, this is kind of a best case client requirement. More than likely, you would see the requirement, I want to be able to log into my site. That second part, in order to edit my content, is a feature that part of a requirement clients will leave out a lot. Don't tell me what you want me to build. I can build that, but tell me what you want me to build and tell me the goal that you're intending this feature to accomplish. I'm the web expert, I'm the expert you hired to help, or the in-house expert that's helping make your dream a reality. Tell me what you're trying to accomplish so I can have the context to build what I need here. So right up front, if I didn't have that, I would need to have a conversation with the client and make sure that I got what I needed. But this is kind of a pseudo requirement we get from a client, which I would immediately take and rewrite, or maybe get the client trained to write this themselves in a dream world that's perfect. But I'd rewrite these in a user story. Something that identifies more working pieces. The structure here is, as an anonymous user, I want to be able to log into my site so that I can edit my content. This is kind of a standard structurized way of writing out requirements using the Gherkin syntax. The big introduction here is that we break this out into pieces, and we have the first line as you identify a user. These are probably going to be, or you identify a user that would be accomplishing the actions. This helps us, especially in the Drupal world, know what role the player is in this feature and who it's intended for. The second is we state what the action is that you want to happen, and then we have the final line is what the goal is. All these pieces are important context when we're trying to build a feature the client wants to meet a business goal, not just becoming a code monkey and building kind of one-off requests. But this is our user story. This is what we translate the user requirement into, so we have full context. Now we start writing acceptance criteria. Acceptance criteria is kind of specifies the inner and outer edge of this requirement of how we'll accomplish this and what it means. Ideally, we would write this up front. We'd get the user requirement. We'd write the acceptance criteria, and before we went further into development, we'd make sure that the client looked at it at least and reviewed it or checked it over with our product owner, that it made sense. And the reason for this is we use this kind of funny structured syntax. It's, again, Gherkin. And can you guys see that with the contrast? Yeah. All right. I have this funny syntax, and it's, given I am an anonymous user, when I am at this page, and I do this thing, and I fill in this, and I press this button, then this. It's kind of strange and it seems ambiguous, but what this does is this creates a unified language to communicate with the clients and the project managers and other developers. You know exactly what I'm doing. I know exactly what I'm doing. The client knows exactly what I'm doing. Like, we can agree that this is what's happening. This is how we write acceptance criteria, and this is how a great way to communicate with clients and assert what the behaviors are. This is a great way to say, like, you say you want to log in. What does login mean? Login's kind of a standard feature. It's out of the box. We don't even think about it. But if it wasn't and we needed to further define that, we can say this is what we mean when I say login. And we would know that if we had passed all those criteria, we could say that the login feature was done. Another part of the requirement was I wanted to be able to edit content. They just didn't want to be able to log in. They want to be able to edit content. So again, I'm running through my given, when, then statements of, given I am logged in as a user, and I'm the administrator role. When I go to add a node page, I'll see the header that I expect to see there. I'll see create basic page. I'll also assert that I have a HTTP 200 response and I didn't get an access denied. This is a way, again, we're just saying, what does it mean to be logged in and say we can edit content? So altogether, really it seems like we're just talking about the client when we're rewriting client requirements and acceptance criteria. We take all that then and we throw it in a .feature file. I apologize in advance. I know there's a naming conflict in Drupal. These are not Drupal features. These are plain text files that have the .feature extension. In Behat, they consider their tests to be features. But we save this in a plain text file with the .feature extension, and more or less, it's written kind of how it's written out how we described it. The only differences are, or to break this down anatomically, we have our user story at the top here, which provides context of what the thing is we're actually building. Underneath, we break our test into scenarios that we've written. I have the first scenario is that I can log in and authenticate to the site. The second scenario is that I can edit content. This text file, in and of itself, is an executable test. I can run this in Behat and get results. And yes. Yes, I will cover that, actually. I'll get to that in just a second. But to look at kind of where that feature file will live, this is a kind of typical Behat Drupal instance. So here I'm making the assumption that the www root there is the Drupal doc root. That's where Drupal core is installed. Everything else is what we talked about here. I've got a composer.json file with my dependencies defined. Those dependencies are then, once installed, are installed in my vendor directory. I've got a README because I always have one, and a behat.yaml to tell Behat how it's configured. My Behat features actually go into a features directory that it doesn't have to be at the root level. You can configure Behat to know where it is, but the feature we just described would be user_login.feature, so that Behat could then execute that test. And instead of just having a screenshot of this, we can actually run through this. Live demos and all. So I have, to go with the installation instructions of setting up Behat and getting everything installed to make this easier. I have a VirtualBox that's on GitHub, which is linked in the slide, and I'll show you at the end presentation. It's a Vagrant box that has Behat installed and configured out of the box, and has Drupal in its core, and has some test features for you to play around with. So I encourage you to use this. It's the same thing downloaded. I just cloned and Vagrant up this morning, so it's available exactly how you see here on GitHub for you to play with. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to run the feature that we just wrote to assert that we can log in. And this is what I'll get. I can see the green color is kind of ideally what I look for, but this is the test results that I see. And as a developer, I'm happy if any testing framework tells me things that are green. I get some statistics down at the bottom that there was one scenario that I ran, and that scenario passed. Each one of the individual given, when, then statements is considered a step. That's a specific action that Behat knows how to interpret and actually execute on the site. So there's a Drupal site. This is actually it. There's a base Drupal site that it's running these tests against. It just went to user login, filled in admin for the username and password, hit login, and then asserted that you can see the logout button. Fun fact, this is actually how Drupal 7 asserts in their simple test suite that you can log in. That's the best authentication test that they have to run against it. They just verify that a logout link appears on the page. But what's fun about this is this is a completed test that I can understand, my PM can understand, my product owner can understand, and the client can understand. If at any point a feature fails a test, maybe we run our whole test suite on pull request or any of that, if at any time a test fails, anybody can look there and go, oh, well, this test is failing because the login button, pressing the login button failed. Depending on the error, Behat does a good job of describing maybe why it failed. If it doesn't see the element on the page, it'll tell you the element's not on the page. You can go and investigate. But everyone knows what's going on. And it creates, again, this great communication channel between what's going on in the project, what's working, what's not. Another side note, if you've written simple test, be excited. We ran this whole test suite, and actually that was a rather slower run, but we ran through this whole test suite, which means we loaded a Drupal site, went to 3 different pages, and asserted a bunch of stuff in 2.5 seconds. Not that big of a deal in Behat or simple test for one, but through the course of a project that's been going on for 2 to 3 months to a year, when you have 2,000 tests to run, that makes a big difference. So, as to your question as to the @API tag that we have, that tells Behat to use the Drupal extension. There are a slew of other tags and ways you can organize your test. And I mentioned this after I mentioned how fast the tests run. Behat test will run and I think it's buried in there. No, it's fine. That was beautiful. So the reason I mention is our test ran so fast is by default, when we're running our test, we're not loading the web page in the traditional sense. All of these tests, these test suite specifically, are interacting with the DOM. So we kind of shortcut the web experience for speed and efficiency's sake. When this test run, it's actually just running and using, it's a HTTP kernel. We're just fetching the DOM more or less from the site and interacting with the elements on that level. If you wanted to test something that required JavaScript, which we can't do with just pure DOM interaction, you could throw a JavaScript tag up there, and then that will load a configured JavaScript or browser that you can run JavaScript tests in. The difference is that's an actual browser. It's going to make the web request. It's going to render your page. You're going to have to wait for things to load. It's going to significantly slow your test suite down. Additionally, with the tags there, you can organize your tests. You can tag tests you can tag tests that you don't want to run. You can tag tests to run in certain groups. I could tag all my migrate tests to run together. It's just a way of kind of organizing. It's a way of either specifying what dependency that test has or organizing your test to run in groups. Yeah?
So just to make sure I'm clear on how that works, you would actually see a browser pop up and the JavaScript get clicked and all that?
You could. So in my...
there's like Casper, does it run? Does it have to...
Yeah, so my preference for doing this, because I bake this into an automation process and this runs usually on a CI instance, I use Phantom.js and it's headless, so you don't actually get a visualization of it. You can, though, even though it's headless, you can set up your test suite on a failure to take a screenshot, and it works most of the time. And you can save or upload that. Like on failure, take the screenshot, upload it somewhere so you can reference exactly what was on the page when it failed.
How does it screenshot?
Yeah, yeah, it's a virtual frame buffer. It's yeah, it's magic.
So it can be run on a server side in a Linux VM in the cloud.
Yeah.
With no X server running.
Yes. In fact, that's what this. Here's the magic box I was talking about. That's what it is. It's a vagrant box of Ubuntu server with a web server and all the dependencies installed. If I were to run my test suite, hook it up to Travis or Circle CI or Jenkins, you could run all this in headless. There's no X server. There's no GUI sits in front of this. But alternatively, you also could, if you wanted to set this up locally to use like a Selenium server, you could have it run in a mode where there is a GUI and slow down the speed because it goes as fast as it can. So you can actually see what happens if you want to see page interactions. Oh, those are really good questions. All right, so yes, moving on.
I have one question.
Yes.
I ran into some limitations with upload, download, those type of stuff with Phantom J. So should there also have this problem?
So if you wanted to test like uploading files, that gets tricky. It's actually very tricky. You can do it, and that's not a limitation on Phantom or Selenium or any of the drivers. That has to do more with the tool chain and the stack. There's a large stack that you need to run Behat test. You need either an HTTP kernel or a driver like Phantom. You need a web driver to tell, that talks to Mink to tell you how to interact with that. There are several available out there, and there's a lot of documentation on behat.org around it. If you want, you can ask me afterwards. It's a little outside the scope. This is more of this is a quick and dirty way to get started. There's a lot of nuances you can configure and go outwards. So wanted to talk briefly about a common thing that you can test for in Drupal, and that's creating content. Along with hooking Behat up to Drupal, the Drupal extension provides a lot of definitions for you. Definitions are just tests, they're step lines that you can write that already have, Behat already knows how to run them and how to execute them. And you can actually see that here. So I have, on my virtual box, I have Drupal extension set up. If I type Behat in DL, I'll get a definition list. And I'll get a list of all of the definitions Behat ships with out of the box and that the Drupal extension gives me. And you see a lot of these are kind of tailored towards, A, there's a lot, and B, there's a lot of them that are tailored specifically towards Drupal-specific functionality. Like, given users, you can specify very quickly that I'm a user, given vocabulary terms. You can do a lot of interactions in Drupal using the Drupal extension, which is what we'll look at here. Wanted to briefly look at creating content. This is just another .feature file where we're asserting that we can create basic pages. This scenario, I'm saying that the actual test that executes, I'm saying, given I'm logged in as a user with the admin role, so I'm saying who I am, what permissions I have, or more specifically what role I have, saying I can see the logout button because that's how we assert that we're logged in. Going to node add, verifying again that I get the right HTTP code, and saying that I'm seeing the correct text on the page. I left these two options in here. It's kind of, they're asserting the same thing, that I'm logged in and I have access to the node add page. There's multiple ways you can assert things, and there's additional ways I can assert that I can create page. I could do it programmatically by hitting Drupal's core, but these tests are more meant to ensure that the behaviors we've defined are the way that we expect. No way a user at least shouldn't be able to like ping Drupal core and get at creating nodes that way. I want to make sure that I can imitate user interactions here, which is why I'm verifying from the user's perspective that I can create these pages. But My second scenario, I actually go through and I create a page content type. Behat has this fun functionality. If you wanted to pass several parameters into it, you can use this table format, which isn't aligned correctly, but basically you can create a table to pass in. It parses it into an array. The top table or table header is what you can think of as your array keys. But I'm saying I have page content, so it's going to create a page node or basic page node in Drupal. I'm telling that I have a title, a body, and an author field. I'm telling it what those are. I could create several columns under that in the table to create as many nodes as I wanted to. Then I'm going to verify that when I go to the home page, I can see that page is created. Drupal by default will aggregate posts that you create on the home page. Just to kind of illustrate this, the ability of Drupal extension to leverage Drupal's existing systems. Same example, we're just creating a content type. The difference here is, saying you can add content to Drupal fields is kind of difficult to say because you can define Drupal fields. There are a lot of them out there. Drupal extension handles a lot of the, I'd say, most common field types for you, like location fields, event date. You can see, like I'm creating a event content that I don't have created in my site, but a typical event content, and it has a date with a field. You can pass in the timestamp, and that will get created. It can handle date fields. It can handle entity reference fields, node reference, most of the standard Drupal fields. It can't do things like field collections very well yet. But then once I create this content with all these field types, I could go to them and assert that the value I put in on these fields, if I go to this page with this event on it, the values in my fields are on the page as I expect. Fun note about creating content, or really anything in scenarios, once it's done, the Drupal extension is set up and designed to return the site back into the state that it was when you started running the test. So what that means is if I create any users, terms, content, or taxonomy using the Drupal extension during the test to assert that the creation behavior and it shows up where I expect it to be, once that scenario is over, it's going to clean all that up out of the site and return it into the state that we let the test run on the beginning. So these can run on a site. Should not ideally run them in production, but you can run them on any, and it won't interfere with any user experience, and they won't see data they don't expect it to be. That's kind of the Behat testing mentality. Is the assumption is the site's in some kind of known state. If you're testing, you don't want to. You want to make sure the site's in a state that you know that it should be, and then start running the test suite. The test suite should do any modification it needs to assert behaviors are true, and then return it back to where it was when it started. So let's clear this out. Want to run. I'm going to run another test. This one is a failure. Oh, no, it's not, because I tested that the test would work. Oh, live demos never work out. But thus far, I've been writing out these kind of text, these human-readable text lines that have been executable, which is interesting. The reason I've been able to get away with that thus far is I've been using only Drupal provided, or Drupal extension provided definitions that appear in that list. There are times when you need to write stuff that isn't defined in the shippable Drupal definitions. Like this example here. That fails now. And this is actually when you start a task, what you'd see a test that was failing. What's nice is rather than just saying you have a failed test, it tells you exactly where your failed test is. It's line 8 in my workbench feature. So what I'm trying to assert here is that certain modules are installed on my site, which could be something you want to validate. But that's something that out of the box Drupal extension doesn't ship with. So how do we write new definitions for tests that aren't provided for us? Even each one of those steps, the given I'm logged in or and I go to this page, have a corresponding definition that's provided by Drupal extension. We can write our own definitions. So how Behat works when it executes is it takes each one of those lines out of our feature file and it does a regex match to an annotation here in a doc block above our definitions where we would write these. So when I write out, given I am an anonymous user, it's going to go and match this up via an annotation to this method. And this is actually ripped from the Drupal extension. And it has a bunch of internal methods, so it's going to call its method is logged in to assert that you're not logged in, and if you are logged in, it's going to log you out. That's the behavior, that's the actual behavior of what happens when you call the step, given I am an anonymous user. I talked about the step definitions provided. You can see all of them that you've written, all of them that you've written that are available, all the ones Drupal extension written that's available. Basically anything that your behat.yaml is configured to make available to your test suite will show up in this definition list. So I'm going to write a custom step definition for this because I want to be able to assert that certain modules are enabled and installed. Maybe I added a bunch of contrib modules and I want to assert that they're actually there before a deployment. So to do that, you have a class file. You could write all this out. Much like Josh was talking about earlier in the keynote, there's scaffolding also available in Behat. You can type Behat init, and it'll throw a scaffolding file together for you. It'll make sure that you're using the right namespace, and you're loading all of your dependencies. You would then write all of your class definitions within this. This is called a feature context file. In our case, if we use the behat.yaml with the Drupal extension and hit Behat init, it'll make sure to extend the raw Drupal context to make sure that all of the Drupal provided connections that are there are available so we can hook into Drupal during its bootstrap. But this is actually what we would write. This is a method that we would write to potentially assert that a module was installed. My annotation at the top, if you noticed, this is actually a new feature with Behat 3. I said these match regular expressions. You can write regular expressions to basically specify what your what the parameter is there, that it's a string, that's a parameter, it's a string, or it's an interval. With Behat 3, they have this much cleaner notation of you just have the colon and it handles that on the back end for you. So I'm saying anytime I say given some module is installed, this is the step definition I want Behat to run to assert that my module is installed. So pretty simple. I'm just going to run if module exists. Module exists is a Drupal functionality that's provided by core. Because of Drupal extension, this is available and we can run this. And if module exists says true, then I'm done. Nothing else to do here. If it doesn't say true, keep going through, and all I do is I throw an exception with the message on it that says some description back to the user. And you can see my exception here is module, whatever the module name is not installed. That's exactly what the user sees when they run this test, is that module wasn't installed. To my point earlier when I was talking about getting to know your code base a little bit better, this just happens inherently when you're writing tests. Module exists to me says that the module is there and Drupal has access to it. This actually will verify that the module is there and it's installed. Wasn't inherently clear to me until I had to dig through and I had to actually look at this method in Drupal core. So you will gradually get a better and stronger grasp of the code base that you're working with. As proof of concept, so if I had gotten the requirement that I had to add the Workbench module to my Drupal site, I'd get this, here's my acceptance criteria. My acceptance criteria fails because I just started this task. I would do a bunch of work. Possibly it was a lot of work to get Workbenches, possibly it wasn't. I would say, okay, I think that I'm done with this requirement. I think I've done everything to satisfy this requirement. I could run the test again. Now I know for a fact that it's done the way that the client originally agreed that it should be done, or that how we were going to implement it, and everyone in the tool chain knows that it's done. Additionally, anyone doing a code review can see the Behat scenario that I added to assert this feature is done, so they could quickly verify that these commits or this branch is supposed to accomplish this behavior and verify that it works. Here's just another example of potentially another custom definition. Again, to my point earlier, you can write out regular expressions if you want. I think the newer syntax is a little bit cleaner and easier documenting. So this def definition I wrote was just to assert that migrations were complete. If I wanted to assert that there were some migrations sitting in this code repo that haven't been run yet, we're trying to get, I just want to verify that they can run in all their entirety. Pass the migration name in. From there, again, because I have access to Drupal's to Drupal and its Bootstrap layer and its habit of putting everything in the global namespace, I can get the instance of the migration just out of the global namespace, make sure that it's complete. If it's complete, do nothing, which just verifies that all records have run on a migration. If it's not, create an error message, throw the error message back to give some description to the test executor or the user or the dev or whoever to know that this had failed. The beauty of these are, once you have a collection of these tests, every time you add a new feature, it's going to assert that everything that's written before it still runs as well. And that's what I was getting at when you have less regressions. You're going to be able to assert that all of the features you've said are done and you agreed on how should work are still that way and never revert. Yeah.
I already mentioned this, but are you not using the T function there because we don't really need this in the translation interface, or like why is printf versus?
Well, this is not getting. We're not dumping this into Drupal at all. All this is going to do is pass this to our test runner. So we could, if we wanted to log this, internally, but. This is just telling Behat what to pipe to standard out or to a log file or wherever. So we could run it through a T function, but I don't think it's necessary at all. Yeah.
So we have access in a custom definition to anything that's normally accessible in Drupal as Bootstrap. So is there a user global or?
Yes. For the most part, there are some weird edge cases, but for the most part, yeah.
So who tests the tests? I mean, these can get pretty complicated, right? This could get, the scenarios can get very complex.
That's a good question. You will, so to throw an example out here, if you got a requirement that was, I need this awesome complex form with all of the Ajax ever. That's kind of a weak spot of Behat testing, and because of the browsers that it can use. JavaScript, Ajax especially, it struggles with. The level of effort to write an extremely complicated test may not be the benefit may not be there. It sucks. Maybe you can shorthand to make sure, you can kind of take some shortcuts. Like, instead of testing the Ajax works, make sure that all of the form elements are on the page. Instead of trying to run through the user interface and running the Ajax form through that way, you can kind of cheat it in the database layer and then assert that the behavior is there that you want. The value may not always be there on the complexity of the test. As far as asserting that the tests do what you want, you can remove. You could write tests for the test, but usually they're very explicit in what they're doing. If you wanted to see what they're doing to kind of manually QA your test, you can remove all the cleanup functions out and kind of kill it mid-test run to see what state changes it made to the site and where it's at. Is that?
Yeah, so I was just trying to thinking of like a scenario where you've got like a VBO operation that's going to run some rule, and you want to make sure from all the way across it would be, you got all kinds of conditions in your rules, you've got actions that fire afterwards,
The beauty of Behat is that it's more testing, it's acceptance level testing. So you can have, because Drupal itself is complicated, even just to get to the home page on a core install is very complicated in the call stack and everything that happens. We're only concerned about user interactions for the most part. We want to make sure that if a user with permissions is on a form and clicks the button to run the VBO, that the expected end result of the VBO is there. And we could set the states, whatever the rule conditions were, we could set the state of the site, however they would get set by the user anyway. Like the user's logged in, it's October, we can set things like that. But we're more concerned about the end result of the behavior than all of the individual units that make the behavior happen. Does that make sense? It's more of system-wide testing than individual unit testing. Does that make sense?
Okay, so not unit testing.
Yes. Yeah. It's difficult to unit test in Drupal. If you hypothetically, if you wanted to make a form and unit test your form, you're now unit testing Drupal's form API, your code, and some other dependencies get strapped on that. So in certain areas, you can kind of squeeze in Behat as unit testing, but for the most part, it's system testing, which is what we've done here. All of the actions we've defined in our steps are steps the end user would take.
Can you instantiate this on browser?
Do what?
Can you run this on browser? Behavior is more from the front-end perspective, right? How the flow is happening.
Mm-hmm. Can you run it on different browsers?
The screen is in place, where the module is in place, more something from front-end perspective. Is there a way to invoke that from the browser?
It's not the best for cross-browser testing or visual regression testing. I think there are better tools out there for it. You can, but you won't get the results you expect, and the browsers you have access to are limited. It's more for testing specific behaviors than the styling and theming. I think there's definitely better tools out there if you're going to try testing front-end aspects of your site. Yeah?
I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how you have this integrated into your CI stack.
I can afterwards. I intentionally left that out of the scope because I think that's... I love that, and I'd love to talk to you all day about that. I just, outside the scope of this. So, last thing I just want to mention here is, we talked about doing things in the browser, and whether it's the manipulating the DOM elements or you actually have a headless browser loaded up. All of that's going to go through Mink, which is basically an abstraction layer. Rather than having to learn the API for Phantom and Selenium and any other browser emulator that you could use, Mink just acts as an abstraction layer for us on that. So anything that's implemented in Behat is made available has to use the Mink interface, which means it defines what these methods mean. So we can basically load the browser session element within our custom step definitions, and these are just some very basic ways to interact with the browser. Of like, find me this exact element. You can use CSS selectors, jQuery selectors, or really any of the selectors you can. And then you can do things like give me the text of that, give me the HTML of that element. If you grabbed a paired element, you can see the whole blob of HTML. You can click, you can press, you can enter text. You have a way to interact with the browser as well, not just Drupal. So that's all for me. Want to end with tests are awesome. They're not hard. Please go forth and try and explore. To make that easy, I'd say the Behat documentation is actually really well documented for the project. It's a great resource. I actually just used it this morning to add a slide. I also have my Behat in a box there on GitHub. If you have Vagrant and VirtualBox, those are dependencies, but grab that and you're good to go after you hit Vagrant up. It'll probably take 10 minutes. The README is fairly well fleshed out, so if you wanted to get hands-on with it without dealing with the installation or the setup or the hassle, it's there. I find the article one of my former colleagues wrote, Michelle Krejci, No More Excuses. And to your end, where you asked about the CI stack, like I agree with her on almost every point she made in that series. It's a 5-part series about how we can take Drupal into a CI stack and actually actually define dependencies in Drupal 7, have a build process, have automated testing, and how that works across development to CI. So that's it for me. There's my Twitter handle. Any other questions?
Someone else? No.
Go ahead.
Two questions. One technical, Mink versus Casper. Is there a reason why Mink?
Mink's kind of a hard dependency of Behat as that abstraction layer. I think you can use Casper. I think you can use Casper Casper JS instead of Phantom JS.
Oh, okay.
I just dealing with the JavaScript Ajax interactions. I've had the best luck with Phantom. There's pros, there's certain functionality each one supports and other ones don't. It's finding the one that matches your needs best.
I'm still trying to figure out there's all these names. Where is it?
I intentionally leave that out because the dependency stack is huge.
Okay, round of applause for Chris. Thank you.